Hello everybody, my name is Terry Jones and I've been a modeler in Ottawa for over 40 years since I was a kid, and it was a hobby I never really outgrew, something I always enjoyed. About 15 years ago, I sold everything that I had in the hobby when I thought I was going to buy a sports car. Turns out I didn't buy the sports car, so when I got back into the hobby, I made two fundamental decisions. One was most of my airplanes, almost all my airplanes, would be 1/72nd scale. The second one, and why we're here today, is I decided I'm going to hand paint my models. And so I decided to get back into the hobby and hand paint models. Why do I want to hand paint models? Well, I find it gives me more control, and it's an organic approach to painting your models. It's simple and pretty straightforward, and the cleanup is pretty basic too. To clean up, I use enamel paints, so I'm using a jar of bar salt. It would be a simple jar like this, and then I would just stir my paintbrush, clean it, dab it on a paper towel, and it would be clean, and I would go on to another paintbrush. What paints do I use? I prefer enamel paints. I find they give you more time to work with the paint. They don't dry as quickly as acrylics. That being said, you can really hand paint any brand that's out there. You just have to test it, see how it works with, they sell a product called a retarder, and that will slow down the drying time of your paint. And then that gives you more time to work and less streaks. But I prefer enamel paints, and most of you are familiar with enamel paints. Brands like Humbrol, Model Master. A brand I bought to try, True North Paints. And you can also hand paint lacquer paint, and since available here locally, Hobby Center, I tried the Mr. Color lacquer base paint, and it spreads on very nicely. There's an example of just some RAF interior green that I tried the other day just to see how it would paint on, and the Mr. Color, I was surprised. It went on very, very nice. If you're hand painting, of course, the most important tool is your brushes. What kind of brushes do you use? Well, like painting your house, oh sorry, it went down I think, use the brush that's right for the job. If you're doing fine detailing paints, Hobby Center has a nice set of detail brushes here that you can see, nice set to use fine painting. For large areas, wings and stuff, you want to use a wider brush so that you're not making as many strokes to apply the paint. Tamiya makes a nice series of fine detail brushes. Also here available here is the Atlas line of brushes. They make a nice variety, small, wide, hard, and soft brushes, which I'll get into later on about which ones I use. And then some of these brushes here are just like a who's of hobby shops I've probably visited over the years. While most people go look at the kits and see what they have, I make a beeline to the paintbrushes, see what kind of paintbrushes do they have, and get different paintbrushes. But your local hobby shop will have a good selection of paintbrushes and paints for you to apply. Now, when you're painting your model, you want to it's much similar like painting your house. You want to plan your steps. You want to get all your basics and everything done prior to doing your painting. Your puttying, and fix up any imperfections that you see. If you choose to rescribe panel lines and things, that has to be done obviously before you paint. And preparation is key. You want to make sure all that's done so when you're painting, you have all of that in place and the paint will go on nice and smoothly. I use what's called sectional painting when I paint a model airplane. I don't try to paint the whole thing at once. I'll break it down in steps. And to show you that, I'll use my trusty little homemade model stand here. And I'll use the latest model I finished, the one you're 17. And what I'll do is I'll paint it and I'll break this down into 5 sections when I paint it. Right wing, left stabilizer, right wing, right stabilizer. Or port and starboard, I can never get them which one's which. And then I'll paint the fuselage underside separately. And you have to remember that you can't paint it all in one go with a paintbrush. Limit your time with the paintbrush, because the paint's going to start drying on your paintbrush. So I might do the left wing and the left stabilizer. That brush is gone. I'll clean that brush, get a second brush, and do the other sections, and then finish off with the fuselage. You want to limit your time with the brush because it'll dry, and if it dries, it'll start to pull the paint on the wings. And a nice size brush like this, I usually just start in the center. And the reason I start in the center and not the edge is if you hit the edge, you'll get a run underneath on the other side. So I just start in the center and just go out like this to the edges, and then I'll turn around and go the other way. So that way you're not getting a big run underneath the edges. And like I said, you want to make your model easy to paint, to get to. Make yourself a stand to put it on if you're painting. There's a variety of commercial stands available. This stand that I made here is simply a box that I found that I thought was a really neat size. And at your local hardware store for 79 cents is plumbing insulation. And you just clip it on the side of your box, and depending on what size model you're working on, it gives you a good stand to put your model on. The other thing you'll come across when you're hand painting your models is getting to the clear parts. How do you deal with clear parts? Well, clear parts are tricky for two reasons. There's some that you have to put on the model before you paint. Anyone that's built airplanes like Airfix 72nd scale planes, or even 48 scale bombers, you have to put the clear parts in first. And so what I do is I'll put them in, but after I've cleaned them up and dipped them in future, I'll put them in the model. And when I get ready to paint, I'll use a canopy mask. And the canopy mask is the first time I've ever used a canopy mask, and it was on the Dornier 17 that I have here. This is what a canopy mask set looks like. They're readily available at your hobby shop. They'll probably have to order them for you because there's only 479,000 of these different ones for different airplanes. So this way you can put the panels on your clear parts before you attach them to the plane. And for the parts that you had to put on prior to, you can put the panels on as well. But what I do is I'll take the clear parts, the canopy, and I'll mount it on a ball of tape on something like a stick like this. And I'll have the canopy out here, and what I use to paint it is a little piece of sponge from one of these hardware sponge brushes that you can buy a bag of 15 or so. And then what I'll do is I'll dab it onto the canopy. Rather than trying to paint along the canopy framing, I don't want to go parallel with it in case it bleeds underneath. So I try to approach the canopy at a 90-degree angle. But it's not really overly wet with paint. You're almost dry brushing it on or dry sponging it on. And that way it get in there and there's less chance of run. I start with the interior color, let it dry thoroughly, and then the camouflage colors. And to be honest, on the Dornier, it had two colors. I actually used a paintbrush and hand painted the darker color over. It didn't run underneath. So that was good to know with the clear parts. Other times it's just you have to mask them and be very careful. And usually what I'll do is I'll take the camouflage color and I'll go around the clear parts carefully first before I start painting my fuselage colors. And that way I'm not going to hit it with a brush. So that's one of the uses of using this sponge brushes. Sponges we will come back to because they're also going to help us do some different camouflage patterns and things like that. Now, when you're finished painting your model and you've got this model all ready to decal, the step you have to come across is gloss coating your model, because decals won't adhere to a flat finish. And the reason for that is the flat finishes tend to be very rough. And when you put a decal on a flat surface, it doesn't conform universally. So what happens is you get what's called silvering, and it's the light showing underneath the decal. So for my gloss coats, when in the early days when I was painting these, I was using the spray cans. And I found over time, I couldn't regulate the pressure of the spray cans. So like I said on the handout here, I'm a cheater. I did go buy a Badger 200 airbrush. I only use the Badger 200 for gloss coats and flat coats. I don't use it for any paints at all. It gives you that control of putting the flat coat on and the gloss coat on even at an even rate, and certainly very smooth. Once you have your airplane all nice and shiny, then you can mount your decals on it. You see them here, all different kinds of decals. And then you're ready for your flat coat. You want to make sure everything is attached to the model and everything when you put your flat coat on, because it's sort of like your final step in your finishing. You hit it with a flat coat and everything, and that's where you'll find out whether you have silvering or not. One of the one of the drawbacks of hand painting is that no matter how hard you try, it's still an uneven finish. And I had some silvering on the side with the lettering. And that'll happen because you're physically put with the brush strokes, it's hard to get it down to a really smooth surface to put your decals on. But as you can see from here, I'll tilt that up, I don't know if I get my hand out of the way, it doesn't look too bad on the side, I don't know for what you can see there with the lettering. But that's what I use for the clear coats when you're putting on your decals. Are there any drawbacks to hand painting? Well, of course there are some things that you can't tackle as well as you can with an airbrush. Luftwaffe modeling camouflage on the side of Luftwaffe airplanes is something very tricky, as well as a demarcation line between camouflage. And I mentioned in this little handout, think of a US Navy Corsair that goes from dark blue to intermediate blue to white. How do you paint that so it doesn't look like there's solid lines in between? Well, there's two things you can use for that. You can use small Q-tips, which unfortunately I forgot to bring, and if you pull the end of the Q-tip and make it kind of fuzzy, you can dip it into your paint, and when you apply it, you're just going along the demarcation and it gives you that feathered edge between the two colors. The other thing, especially for the modeling, is you can just take one of these things, one of these sponge brushes, which I think are initially for varnish application for woodworking. Pull off a little piece of sponge like this, and then you can just dab the camouflage color on the model. And I did that here with this Japanese cake. That's been done, applied with a sponge. And what I did was I used 2 circle masks that I put on where the Hinamarus would be located, sponged the green on top, and then when I peeled off the masking, I had a perfect spot to put the Hinamaru on so that you can see the gray around it because they would have masked it when they shot the camouflage. But that's applied with a sponge, and you're applying the sponge almost to a point where it's almost half dry because you don't really want to use a wet sponge because the paint could run or it could go on too thick. You'd rather put on less because you can always put more on. For the Luftwaffe camouflage, like I was speaking about, this ME-109's been done with the sponge. Just carefully along the fuselage where the blue comes up. And it I don't know if you can see that on there. It's kind of tough to see this little guy. Turn it this way. The camera is. You can see that camouflage there. But mainly with the sponge trick, the technique with using a sponge, I recommend just take your time, practice. You can practice on plastic yogurt containers. If you have somebody who does protein powders, these lids, I have a ton of them when my son was weightlifting and everything. They make a great little dish to try any kind of paints on. As we mentioned earlier, using the retarder, you can put your paints in these little shot glasses, and we'll be doing shots after. And you can put the retarder in here and thin it out and see how it works on your model. There's all kinds of little containers and things out there that you can use for that. Now, swirl camouflages, really hard to do with a paintbrush because if you pause, you get a puddle. And it's the one thing that's really tricky to get done. And so in this case, I built a Japanese plane called the An. And what I used here is one of these paint markers. Paint markers you can get at hobby shops as well. Art supply stores have a large selection of them. And you can simply use them just for doing camouflage like that. The tricky thing with some of them is they'll leave a puddle when you start and they'll leave a puddle when you end. So what I did in this case was I was able to seem to keep moving, and then when I get towards the end of it, I just lifted off at the very end so I wouldn't get the puddle. But these fine camouflage patterns are tricky with brush painting, but they're not impossible. I like the result. I think it looks kind of funny. It looks kind of good. The other thing that's really difficult to paint, hand paint, is white and yellow. They're two colors that are really tricky to get good coverage on. A really great figure modeler in Ottawa, Brian Latour, showed me a trick using white inks and then using your Vallejo or any of your acrylic whites. Using the ink These go on almost like a primer, but the nice thing is they go on very dull and very thin, so you can build up successive coats. Now sometimes I'll cheat. If I put a ball of tape on here, put on a spinner, I'll pop outside and I might use a can of the Tamiya Extra Fine Lacquer Primer. Use it outside because it's very, very strong. You need good ventilation. But you put a couple of coats of that on and you've got a nice matte white subject that's ready for your final white. And then that has good coverage, is a good way of getting the white to cover as well. Yellow is tricky, but not impossible. These are, that's yellow painted with Humbrol, just a couple of coats of yellow, chrome yellow for the nose of the ME109. But yellow is one of those tricky things to get to cover. But it's hand painting is one of these things that, like any form of modeling, any form of hobby, it takes time and practice. And the nice thing is, as I look back on these planes and I start going, each one seems to get a little bit better. You know, it's one step at a time. And with a large stash that I have in the basement, I'm bound to get one of them right sooner or later. And with these, as long as you're improving, going to the next step, that's all you can do, because it's a lot of fun, and I thoroughly enjoy it. Again, the only thing you have to be careful of is I really enjoy the enamels, but over time enamels are going to be moved probably out of the hobby because of the use of solvents, things like that. A couple of people at the local IPMS chapter were telling me the other day they really like hand painting the new Revel acrylics. They said they were very, very nice with the unusual square bottle. So, you know, you can pop in and grab a couple of those colors and try them, see how they work. And hand painting is one of those things that I do it for just about everything. Here's the interior. You can see that there, the little seatbelts. This is the interior of the next plane I'm working on, a BR-20. This is all hand painted using enamels and a set of what's called Kit's World, little 72nd scale seatbelts. There we go. Now over the camera. You can see little seatbelts on there. And once you get this through a canopy that's nice and thick, you probably won't see much of it. It's just when people look at the model, you'll want to see something that looks like something's happening in that cockpit. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else that I need to mention about hand painting. Again, I was talking about the different little containers to mix your paints using retarder. I really enjoy it. I've had people come up to me and say, "No, you really build really nice models and things." And the funny thing is, when I look in the audience today here, that's sitting here, there's people in this room that absolutely get stunning finishes with their airbrushes. So take the steps, do your hand painting. If you're comfortable with it, you can make that jump up to airbrushing. Anything is fine. The bottom line is bring your models out, enjoy this hobby, go down to your local hobby shop, get a model, some paints, and give it a whirl. The internet is a vast road of information that can help you, and certainly your local hobby shop, your local clubs. We're lucky in Ottawa, we have 6 clubs in Ottawa building everything from Gothas to Gunpla models. So by all means, get out, enjoy the hobby, and it's really wonderful, and I hope you found some of this useful, and we'll scan some of the models. You can take a look and see what's there, and if you have any questions, you can probably send them into the link below on Hobby Center site, and they'll pass them on to me. And we have people here in the audience that can ask some questions if they would like. Anybody? Any questions? John.
Terry, what yellow paint gives you the best performance?
I like the Humbrol paint. The Humbrol makes various shades. These ones were done now. RLM04, chrome yellow, school bus yellow. It's all yellow. So I used, I think it was the trainer, RAF trainer yellow. But again, when you that's the one thing that I didn't mention is most of these models have 3 coats of paint on them. Your first coat you put on is going to look awful, like painting your fence in your backyard. The second coat starts to cover better, and if you do go to a third coat, you get a solid cover. Does that eliminate some detail? Maybe a little bit. But as you see it here, you can still see most of the panel lines and the coverage, and these mostly have 3 coats. But yeah, a yellow, I would probably use Humbrol. Now, like I was saying, the enamels will probably get phased out. So I would try the Revel yellow, see how it goes. But remember, you're always better to put it on thin coats. And Glenn,
Hi. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, Terry.
you're welcome.
You had mentioned that you were brush painting some of the Mr. Color lacquers. I've never thought of that before. How do you do it? How do you, thin things, mix things?
Well, to be honest, I don't usually thin a lot of the paints when I put them on with a brush. I bought this one just to try for today because it seems to be a really good line of paint, and the lacquer, I found this one went on really nice and smooth. There's a picture of it here applied to this very Fulmar that I'm doing for a Battle of Britain display. That's just one coat put on there, and it went on fairly well and nice and solid. The nice thing is they've got a huge selection of colors. It's almost like a replacement for the Model Master enamels. Now, I've used the Tamiya lacquers, and I find with both of these, not so much with the Mr. Color, but I found the Tamiya one, I'll put a coat on, and as it starts to dry, when I go with the second coat, it'll lift the first. So put one coat on, let it dry thoroughly before you put that second coat on. It covers very well. And I assume that it will thin, it'll thin with the Mr. Color probably makes their own thinner, or maybe even a lacquer thinner. We had a great presentation. It was put on by Glenn at the model meeting, IPMS meeting this week about different types of thinners to use for paints. So there is a thinner out there, and like I said, there's also these retarder products that slow down the drying. And that's the key with hand painting, because it tends to dry fast on the brush. Brush will leave the streaks. And the other thing too is, one thing about using paintbrushes is it's a physical touch between the model and the paintbrush. Sooner or later, the bristles are going to come off in your paint. When you take them out, if it leaves a mark, don't try to correct them right away with your paint. Let it dry and hit it with small, fine sandpaper. Then go back and paint it. Because I find sometimes you'll do that and you say, oh, I've got this glitch because there's a hair there or a paintbrush bristle. Then you paint it and it ends up gumming it because it's drying in the process. Let it dry, touch it up with some fine sandpaper. But yeah, the lacquers are I think part of that group of paints that give you a really good bite. But again, I'm sort of wondering if they'll get phased out over time because they really don't want to encourage the use of solvent-based paints. The water-based tends to be, probably the go-to for health reasons and environmental reasons. Any other questions?
Harry, how does your technique translate to, let's say, going to like a 1/48 scale? Like you're doing cockpits and you're...
The scale shouldn't matter. I remember years ago, an Ottawa modeler, Randy Lutz, built 32nd scale airplanes, and they were all hand painted. And they were amazing. So the technique applies whether it's a bigger model or a smaller model. You have to just watch the same things when it dries, eliminating the streaks and stuff. But yeah, hand painting in cockpits of 48 would actually be probably a lot more fun because you can actually see more and you'll have more cockpit to paint than the 72nd scale ones. And then 32nd and stuff, the size matters when it comes to painting, and you'll be able to see more of your colors in more detail. But the basics are the same, I think. And it comes to the basics too, like in construction of a model, whether you're building 72nd or 48, 32nd, 24. You have good sanding, good putty work, things like that. It's all part of the process of completing a model that really, you want to be happy with it. You're building for yourself, really. That's and to be happy with it. Most of my models here, in a large model contest, wouldn't get placed because they're up against a wall of beautiful airbrushed models. But on a display table at an event for a Battle of Britain display, people love it. So, and I build mainly just because I enjoy the subjects, and if I get a ribbon or a plaque, hey, it was great. Attendance might be low too, but the thing is that I really enjoy it. So that's really why I build. I love it. Subjects are great, and I have one that just finished the Doinier, and there's one down, another 600 to go. So I'm bound to get it right eventually. Any other questions at all? No. Hey.
Deal with dust.
Dust.
I've got 3 cats and a dog in the house.
Yeah.
And no matter how much time I wash my models, I prep the surface, clean them, try to go to a sterile area, And when I come back, even after a primer coat, there's got the tweezers out and start plucking little bits and dust. And how do you do it?
I don't really know, because I've only seen it a couple of times where you'll get that swirly little dust hair or something on there. And usually, like I said, if you see it in your paint, make sure it dries, and then just take it out with a really fine grit sandpaper, and then go back and touch it up. For storing them, sometimes what I'll do is I'll store, most of them are stored in these plastic containers that are all sealed to keep the dust off for when I want to display them. When I'm building them, I have this small plastic container, which is you can get at Michael's, which is it's for scrapbooking, and I'll put the model in here as I'm working on it, just to keep the dust off during the day or whatever, and then when I paint on them. But a lot of the times I'll just sand it off mainly. I don't get too much of it in. And then you're right, it depends on the environment you're working in. I'm using an upstairs bedroom, so it's not overly dusty compared to like maybe my basement. But yes, I'm sure that the doggies and the animals can contribute to the dander and stuff too, and the fur. Any other questions at all? So make sure if you want to send in comments, you can use the link in the page below and send comments to the Hobby Center. They can forward them on to me, and we can answer them. And if you like this, please put a like on the page, and we hope to see you back soon for another discussion of this wonderful hobby. Oh, still got one more. John.
It's a state-of-the-art performance you've done there with most of your collection.
Thank you.
It's really good.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.